Happy New Year, Chelsea.
Happy New Year, Sarah. Today on the show, we're expanding on one of your most popular articles from 2023, which was called You Can't Scale a Food Business Like a Tech Company.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get into that, I actually want to start with an article that I read that poses the question: what happens when farms become startups?
That sounds interesting.
The article is titled Indoor Agriculture Faces a Reckoning. And we're going to link to that in the show notes in case anybody wants to go and read the whole article. But the article starts: Investors went wild for the utopian promise of tech driven vertical farming.
Okay.
Now the industry is on the brink of collapse. Can it survive by following in traditional agriculture's footsteps? Then we get to the story of Arrow Farms and App Harvest. So both of these companies were previously considered giants of the indoor agro industry. They were operating 9 industrial scale farms between the two of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's not all. They actually had received nearly $400 million in total funding.
Okay.
But as of this summer, both companies have shuttered. Arrow Farms filed Chapter 11 in June, and this is of 2023.
Okay.
And shortly after, App Harvest was selling off its assets to creditors and competitors.
Okay. So we have tech farms essentially that got a lot of funding and then closed. My hunch is that funding dried up and the businesses weren't operationally profitable, and that's why they closed. That's my guess here. But you tell me, Chelsea, why did they go out of business?
Yeah, this article actually cites the rising energy prices
Okay.
and interest rates, which we talked about last season, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that coupled with the fact that 2023 saw a 91% drop in venture capital investment from the prior year.
Right. Yeah. Again, relating back to the last episode that aired and the news, article that we talked about there. So, and I think, across the board, no matter what industry you're in, you saw rising costs in 2022, 2023. But with VC funding, there's an expectation of getting a return on your investment within some period of time. And if we've got expenses rising and funding, right, money becoming more expensive, that altogether leads me to believe that investors are going to want a quicker turnaround on their money, right? And if firms can't deliver, that's when the funding gets pulled. And so my hunch is that that's sort of what was happening here, that's what was at play a little bit.
Yeah, Sarah, you're totally right. And the author actually drills down on that point, pointing out that the struggles across indoor agriculture point to major identity issues.
Mm,
Okay. Many indoor ag companies were pitched, funded, and run as tech companies. That ultimately got them the money they needed, but the money came with venture capital expectations, right?
yeah.
We actually even get a quote here from Ari Ginsberg, who's the professor of entrepreneurship at NYU, and he studies VC trends. He said that these venture capitalists were starry eyed
Mm,
about the prospect of disrupting a very important industry. They were enthused and flush with cash and they were bought in, but they didn't do their homework on the economics and how long it would take to reach profitability in this industry.
yeah. I mean, speculation here, which I don't normally like to do, but I ventured to guess that these folks didn't go to existing farms and see how things are done and sort of understand the current economics of growing food, right? To
Yeah.
to then be able to iterate on that and create meaningful and profitable change. And I think that we see that a lot with food tech businesses, and I have said it before. I wrote a newsletter about it. We're going to dive further into it today and in the main part of the episode. You cannot scale a food business like a tech company. And
Yeah.
I hope that, while I don't like to see businesses shutter, I do hope that there are, in particular, two things that come out of what we've seen happen in the last year and in cases like this. And that is that, one, more venture capital funding goes to existing food businesses in the real food space that support, improving the current methodologies and ways of doing things in a meaningful way rather than recreating the
Mm-hmm.
system, right? And then two is I think that, or I hope that food founders will start to understand the difference between growth and scaling, why a food business can't scale like a tech company. And once they understand and have appropriate expectations for themselves and their businesses, they can communicate that, stand their ground with that when talking to potential investors so that everyone's expectations are correct. And what I then hope happens as an extension of that is that the businesses are appropriately funded with appropriate expectations and they stay in business longer, right? There's no sudden shuttering of a business because things just aren't going how we thought, or because they're so sensitive to an interest rate increase or a change in the market, right? That the funding needs to change dramatically.
Yeah, and to even further that point, right? Both of these farms, Arrow Farms and App Harvest, actually pointed to unsustainable expenses as the reason or a reason for their bankruptcy filings.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read the article, remember at the beginning when I stated that between these two farms they had taken over 400
Yeah.
right million in funding. So of that 400 million, Arrow Farms actually received it was like around 250 million
Okay.
of that amount. Of that funding, they had spent 80% just on R&D,
Wow. For what were they R&Ding?
trying basically to create like the best crops, right? The best version of these crops. And so I would imagine, right, that if you're spending 80% of
Mm-hmm.
your funding just on the R&D, there's really not a lot left when it comes to actually producing your product.
Yeah. This is reminding me of an article that you and I read recently, Chelsea, and we couldn't find a ton of information on it, but I believe it was called Cooks. They're a chicken
The chickens,
producer.
yeah.
Yeah. So they had venture funding. They had been in business for a couple of years, I believe. They raised chickens, they hired farmers to raise chickens, they had the processing plant. They shuttered very quickly when their funding got pulled out. And in some of the information that we could find, I believe you found that the majority of their funding was spent on R&D in relation to like creating the best chicken,
Yeah.
which was fascinating to me. Like, I'm of the good food mind, and I think there are original chickens out there. You know what I mean? We know farmers that are
We don't,
raising, we don't need a
yeah,
new old chicken.
we don't need to research or
No,
develop
no,
something that already exists.
exactly. Yeah. And like, it
100%.
makes me frustrated because it's like, how much could have been done with that money in both of these cases, right? To really further the food industry, particularly the good food industry, right?
Yeah.
I think innovation is important. I think it's necessary. I think, I'm not by any means trying to say like we shouldn't spend money on trying to create new things, but I think we need to be a bit more level-headed about it and also understand that at least in this case, it wasn't that you could create a program, right, to produce a piece of produce and magically get it delivered to someone's home, right? It's still food. You have to plant a seed, you have to tend to it in some regard, whether it's via technology or the human hand. You need to
Yeah.
raise it, you need to harvest it, you need to transport it, you need to sell it to the grocery store, or, you know, there's so many moving parts to food. And I just don't understand why people believed that tech could eliminate the financial investment and the resource investment that goes into having a food business. You know, as I said a couple of minutes ago, I hope that what we've learned from these experiences sort of changes the way that funding happens in the industry, and how it works for food businesses with investors.
Yeah, Sarah. And it was actually really interesting to see the way that this article kind of wraps it all up by showing how the indoor agro industry has decided that it's time to get back to basics. At this summer's Indoor Ag Tech Innovation Summit, instead of focusing on tech innovations, the presentations and the conversations all revolved around good economics. Okay. The key message was the indoor growing industry should focus on growing produce and being profitable, the core business of farming.
I love that. I think that that makes perfect sense. And, you know, it brings me, right, brings us back to today's topic, right? And Charles, we talk about traditional business media all the time. And it seems to me that there's some confusion or some like crossover in like business terminology and expectations of, you know, what businesses in different sectors can do and can accomplish, and how they can become profitable. And it brings us back to, for me, the big question of like, can you scale a food business? What does that actually look like? And the fact that it can't and doesn't look anything like scaling a tech company. And what we're going to dive into today specifically is the difference between growing and scaling a business and why that matters.
Emily Dye Schiefer here, and I just want to remind you about the live Q&A that Sarah and I are hosting tomorrow inside the Good Food CFO Community, exclusively for Plus members. I can't wait to connect with you and dig into your questions about your food biz strategies. And if you're listening to this episode after January 9th, you can still catch the replay of our live session. This live Q&A and the replay are available to all Good Food CFO Plus members. With your Plus membership, you'll get access to live Q&As like this one, exclusive bonus content, and even attend live podcast recordings. If you're not a Plus member yet, you can upgrade by visiting thegoodfoodcfo.com/join. I'll see you tomorrow.
Sarah, when you first wrote about this topic of like growth versus scale, you did it for a newsletter. And I'm actually going to quote you here.
Okay.
You said, scale is a business buzzword that, much to my dismay, has made its way into the everyday language of food founders, is a focus, and is often misunderstood. The result is unrealistic expectations.
I stand by that statement. I think that scaling your business promises to bring not just more revenue, but more profit, more cash flow, and this like sense of ease in doing business. And it definitely seems like every founder is eager to get there, right? To scale. That's like, it's a place, you know? And there are a lot of people who are selling solutions and paths to scaling your business successfully. And I think the piece that's missing and that most founders don't understand is that you have to grow before you scale, and that those two things are actually very different.
Okay, so what is the difference, Sarah? Like, can you explain that for me?
Yeah, of course. So growth occurs when new business resources are added, which means you're spending money on things like new people to the team, new equipment, new technology, etc. And then revenue grows as a result of those additional resources. Scaling is when revenue increases without an increase in resource spending. So you've got people, you've got technology in place, etc. And now you can grow your revenue exponentially without ever adding more resources to the business. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so that actually does make sense. And it explains why, like, a tech company or an online, course business has the ability to scale like so quickly because once they've created their product and their business is set, right, they are not incurring any more cost, and they can sell their product to as many people as are willing to buy it. They don't incur the cost of creating any additional products. Whereas what we're talking about with food businesses, they do need to create a new physical product for each customer that they serve.
Exactly. And that is why you cannot scale a food business like a tech company. And in the newsletter, I said that scale isn't something that happens quickly for a food business. Instead, it often happens in iterations, right? First comes growth, which provides the ability to then scale a bit. Then capacities are reached and you need more growth, right? More investment, more spending needs to happen to get to the next stage at which you can scale a bit more, and so on and so forth until you reach the capacity and the size that you desire.
So my question here really would be, and I guess I never thought about this before, but if you are investing in the growth of your business, right? And what you talked about just now and in the newsletter is that you invest and you increase capacity, and then you can scale, and then you hit a wall, and you have to do it over and over again. So I guess I'm trying to understand the difference between those two cycles, right? Like if I'm investing in my growth, what then turns it into scaling?
Right. So the growth part is going to be, for example, hiring, maybe you hire another person and you purchase machinery, right? And so now that machinery is going to allow you to produce many more units of product with the same amount of human labor, right? So in an 8-hour shift, we can now produce, let's say, 5 times more product. So I guess it is still considered the growth phase, right? Because you are investing. And as a result of those investments, you're now able to increase your revenue, right? But it's also it could be considered a time of scale because you've stopped making the investment, like the investments are finished, and the revenue can grow up to a certain point. But I think you bring up a good point, right? It definitely doesn't look anything like scaling in a tech or an online business at all. And one might say that food businesses grow, they don't scale. Can you achieve economies of scale? Yes. But those two things, scale and economies of scale, shouldn't be confused, right? Economies of scale is saying if I buy 10,000 of something, I'm going to pay less for each unit than when I bought one, right? And with growth and with increased production, you will potentially achieve economies of scale at some point, not the same as scaling your business.
Really, what you're saying is that as a food founder, as a food business, I'm never going to be in the position to just go wild and scale my business. Like there will always be costs associated with even just increased sales of my product.
Yeah. I mean, if we take it one step further and we look outside of production, the food industry has promos, chargebacks, pay to play costs and fees, right? When you reach a certain point of size, you may have a piece of machinery that can produce as many, I'm thinking about Boychuk bagels right now, that produces as many bagels as you could ever want and need, right? But then when you sell them via distribution or wholesale, there's these additional costs that are going to be incurred to deliver your product. So to me, it's just not the same as scaling a tech business or an online course at all. And for growth in CPG, there will always be new costs associated with it. And I think that that's so critical for people to know, because if we believe as founders and individuals in the industry that scale is possible, that there's some version of the business where the inputs stop, which is what scaling really is, right? Where the inputs stop. We stop having to spend money and the revenue just grows and grows and grows. I don't know that that's a thing that can happen in the food industry.
So my initial thought here is, man, if I've been building a business and I have been like looking towards the future and just thinking about, oh, I just need to get to the point where I can scale this thing. Everything that you just said is probably sounding kind of scary.
Sure. And I don't want to scare people away. And it's not to say that you can't build a profitable business. And it's not to say that as you grow, you can't become more profitable and improve your profit margins, right? What I'm trying to say here is that I want founders to understand what scaling truly means and what growth as a food business and within the food industry actually means, and how those two things are different. I also think that that opens the door for a little bit of kindness to yourself as a founder when you are investing in growth and your P&L, for example, isn't going to show profitability, right? When we just talk about scale as this sort of magical thing that we should be able to do, and we avoid or ignore the intensive costs that come with it, especially in the food space, we're not telling the whole story, and we then can feel really bad and look negatively at our business if we aren't profitable during a growth phase, which I don't want to be the case for founders.
Yeah, Sarah, to your point, that is one of the many reasons that we focus on financial confidence and specifically cash flow here at the Good Food CFO, rather than simply just focusing on profitability, right? Because there will be times in your business where you are in a growth phase, you're growing, and as a result, you aren't showing any profit on your P&L, right? But you, at the same time, you may have cash flow to support it. You may not have cash flow. There's so many different things that can look like, right? So I was hoping you could kind of run us through a couple examples of a business that is in a growth phase and what that might look like. Like, let's kind of take the fear out of it a little bit.
Yeah, I love this idea. So before I provide an example, I do want to remind everyone that a P&L, right, your profit and loss statement, sometimes called an income statement, is a financial report that is structured in a very specific way, and that bookkeepers have to follow very specific rules when recording certain types of income and expenses. So you need to look at your balance sheet, your P&L, your cash flow, right? All three of these things to get the full picture of your business. With that said, let's say that, for example, you took out a small business loan to fund your next stage of growth in your business. And with that money, you hired a new team member or two, you leased a new vehicle, you bought a piece of equipment, and the rest, maybe you're using that to invest in marketing. The loan funds that you received do not show up on your P&L as income. It shows up on your balance sheet as a debt that you owe, right? The equipment purchase is also going to show up on your balance sheet as an equipment asset. But the new team member, their payroll, the vehicle lease, and all of the marketing spending are all going to show up on your P&L. So while each of these investments is designed to increase your sales and your revenue, there's going to be a ramp up period. And while that ramp up is happening, the expense increase could produce a loss on your P&L. And that, I have seen it really freak people out. And so if you don't understand or have a really good handle on the true profitability and cash flow from your operations, then seeing that negative number can shake you. However, if you do track your cash flow and you understand like what portion of your expense increase is being paid for by the loan, and you can see that everything is happening just as it should be, then you can more calmly and confidently proceed through your growth phase, which I think is an important point too, right? Like, because if we don't talk about the expensiveness of growth and the financial inputs that are required, someone can start to embark on growth, get freaked out by the negative cash flow, get freaked out by the negative, number on their profit and loss, get freaked out about, how things are going and if they're making the right decision, and back out, right? Or change when all along they were on the right path. And so again, we just bring it back to that confidence.
Sarah, I never even considered that before, because in my prior experience, right, managing a retail store and a budget was with a corporation, right? And so the only thing that we looked at was our P&L.
Right.
Right. And it was, what are the things that like I'm controlling inside my business?
Right.
That was my focus. And so I never thought before about like, if I am taking on debt, where is that showing up? And then what is that going to make my P&L look like? And that P&L is not necessarily an accurate reflection. Like, that's really opening my mind up right now to how scary it truly can be if you don't know what you're looking at.
Yeah. And I've seen it firsthand, and I think so in addition to knowing the difference between growth and scale, knowing what growth really means, knowing that growth involves spending money, knowing that growth could look like losses on your P&L, having a plan, having a vision for this growth becomes so key and so helpful. To take a line from our friend Katie Melezova, it's a North Star, right? It's like, I know where I'm going. I have made a plan for this growth. I understand what my P&L is going to look like. I understand that if I keep my cash flow, looking a certain way, that I know I'm on the right path, even though the P&L is showing a negative number, right? And to your point about like being part of a corporation, you were like one unit, right, of however many Starbucks there were. Any capital investments that they made probably hit like the corporate books, right? Not your books, right?
Yeah.
They were strictly looking at your operations and if they were profitable or not. And just as you pointed out, when you're not part of a giant corporation and you're just looking at one whole business, the picture starts to look different.
A lot different.
Yeah. And, in the beginning of my work as a consultant, I was all about profitability. And I realized that that's not the language I wanted to use. That's not the focus that I wanted to have, because you can have a healthy business that's really heading toward your long-term goals and have periods of unprofitability. It's just understanding, why is that happening? And am I healthy or not in terms of cash flow? And then you're good to go. So that's why we talk about cash flow so much around here.
So Sarah, you talked about having a plan, right? Having a plan for your growth and how important that is. What are some of the things I can like think about, or how do I really develop that plan essentially?
Yeah. You got to sit down and carve out some time, right? And I say that and I giggle a little bit, but it's a very hard thing to do. But to sit down and think about, where are you now as a business and what are you wanting to build? And I think also remembering that, as I said a couple of minutes ago, you aren't going to go from where you are now. In some cases, you aren't going to go from where you are now to the ultimate picture, the big picture version, right? There may be iterations of growth that are taking place. So get clear on, maybe, where do I want to be at the end of the year? Where do I want to be at the end of 3 years? Where do I want to be at the end of 5 years? And then you can decide, okay, in terms of getting there, do I need more people? Do I need equipment? What are the things that you are going to need to physically produce more product to grow your business? And what do those inputs look like, right? I also suggest that you examine, if you haven't already, your product prices, your product profit margins, your gross profit margins for your business, right? And to make sure that those things are healthy currently, and if not, make them healthy, because you want healthy financials as you start to embark on this investment and financial growth. I think particularly if you are funding this growth on your own, like through debt that needs to start being paid back right away, right? Things of that nature. So have a plan, have a picture, write down very clearly, this is the plan of execution that I want, and then do a double check on the financial health of your business right now. And we talked about that a lot in the last episode of season 8. And then I suggest making a growth plan. And I think that this is really important because you could spend a lot of money in terms of investing, right? To be able to produce more product. But then if once you finish making those investments, you don't have a place to sell those products, or you don't have a plan for how am I going to get my revenue up to support the cost of these investments long term, that can create a financial problem, right? You can go out of business if you don't have the revenue, right, to cover your expenses long term. And then that leads me to the next, which is create an expense forecast. Even with, the example we just had about like the vehicle lease and the equipment and the new team member, right? And the marketing, that funding will eventually run out, right? Or you'll have it for a certain amount of time. You need to know what your sales need to be by a certain date, right? And you're also going to need to know what your extended expenses are going to be. Are you going to continue the marketing investment after the loan funds are gone? Are you going to continue to employ this person after the funds are gone? What's the repayment term on the loan that I have? And making sure that you have, the cash on hand to cover that as well, right? So just really getting honest about what does this look like? Because if you don't, then that's when you get freaked out and you can start to panic.
And you also have me thinking here, like, as you start to walk through these steps, how to create this financial plan for growth. I am someone who I work best in collaboration with others, right? And there's pieces in here, especially in that second step, when you're talking about a sales growth plan, like sit down with your sales team. Have a conversation. What ideas do they have for growing sales, right? Yep. What ideas does maybe your production team have for where the business can go, right? Or how I think that not like you said, taking the time to sit and really think, but also getting out to your team and having those conversations and hearing their thoughts can spark something in you as the founder or the CEO that maybe wasn't even there before.
Yeah. This is reminding me a little bit of our financial forecasting episode that we did with Felice Thorpe. And she recommended the same thing, right? When you're thinking about sales growth in particular, you have to check in with your production team. If you've got new equipment, what is the capacity? What is the capacity? Maybe our equipment has a certain capacity, but at a certain point, we need to add another person to package the product or whatever it might be, right? Do we have enough space in our facility to use the machinery to its maximum capacity, right? Just things like that we can't make assumptions on. Also, to reiterate this again, it costs money to sell your product in CPG. So if you're selling wholesale direct, and especially if you're selling through distribution, what are the additional costs that are going to come with that growth, right? When you're projecting growth in CPG in particular, you can't just say, look how much money I'm going to make because of how many units I'm going to sell. You also have to say, what is the store that I think I'm going to open? What are the free fills or the slotting fees that are going to be associated with that? What are my promos and chargebacks that I'm going to agree to? That's where the picture really starts coming together, and this is like sort of a side topic a little bit, but another place where we see people kind of start to panic when they're in a growth phase is that they haven't considered all of the costs associated with selling more and associated with like taking on new accounts and taking on, especially new stores through distribution. And,
Mhm.
when we talked to April from Vermont Tortilla, that was something that she stated, right? It's like, we didn't know how expensive it was really going to be to do it. And, we had done the work to figure out how much the free fills were going to cost us, but there was just so much more that was going to come that she wasn't aware of. And that's fair and very common in the food space. So to your point, Chelsea, like, yes, bring everyone in the company together so that as one thing changes, you get full insight as to how the other things will change as well. Because nothing happens in a vacuum, right? And that kind of leads me to the fourth thing, which is bring all of these elements together into a financial plan. So not only do you understand, okay, here's how much I need to invest. Here's how much my expenses are going to change. Here's where the loan money is going to run out, right? Based on that spending. So in the meantime, we need to be ramping up our sales. As I have for years, to slow down and think it through. Will the execution be exactly as you map out? No. But if you have a map, if you have that forecast, you have a plan. And I always say this, it can be as simple as you need it to be, or it could be a big, thorough financial forecast like we offer, inside of our courses. It doesn't matter what it looks like. It just matters that it exists, and you can go and you can tweak it when things you didn't expect come about, right? And then see what the new projection looks like.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I was going to say, Sarah. I think one of the most important things of having a plan, whether it's a financial plan or a growth plan, any planning that you do in your business, is not ever because we think this is exactly how it's going to go, right? It's because this is our ideal situation. We know it's not going to go that way.
Yeah.
But then when it doesn't go that way, we have that, as you kind of already called it, that North Star to kind of go back to and tinker and rethink and reapproach.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, just to bring it back to the main topic here, which is, that you can't scale a food business like a tech company, that scale isn't something that kind of happens overnight for a food business. It's not something that, you make a one-time investment and you're there. It often happens in iterations, and remembering that depending on the kind of food business you're choosing to build, there may be additional costs of growth outside of the, human resources and equipment and other kinds of things that happen inside your business. And so just take the most realistic approach you possibly can to what growing your business looks like.
I love this, Sarah. And I would even say that, like, for any founders that are wanting to work through these steps, the Good Food CFO offers a lot of free and low cost resources for digging into this exact kind of work. I could even just name a few podcast episodes that we've done over the past couple of years that speak to all of the things that we talked about today. That first step you talked about, getting clear on where you are now and the business that you want to build. My mind goes directly to episode 56 and episode 89 of the podcast. In episode 56, it was our Rethinking cash flow episode. And I think founders can gain from that episode how to utilize cash flow to support their growth. And then episode 89, which was literally our last episode, you walked us through the process of really getting clear on the current profitability of your business, or like where you are, what your profit margins are, all the things that you talked about in that step 1 of this process.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would also reference episode 58, which you talked about earlier today, which was the episode that you and Felice did around how to create a sales forecast. So if you are working through this process and you get to that step, and I know that we've talked about it a million times, something about a sales forecast makes people run away, right? Go listen to that episode, get comfortable, get confident, because that's really what it's going to take to, have the successful growth that you're looking for.
Chelsea, that's an amazing roundup of episodes. And I think you're exactly right. It's about, being informed and building financial confidence.
For more content like this and connection with other food founders and industry experts, join us inside the Good Food CFO community. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com/join to learn more.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.